It was March 17th, 1944. The air above the Ruhr Valley in western Germany was black with flak, thick enough to walk on, the pilots used to say. Inside the cramped, freezing belly of a B-17 flying fortress nicknamed Lucky Strike, Technical Sergeant Frank Emil Kowalski crouched beside the No. 3 engine, his breath clouding in front of his face. The bomber shook violently. Metal screamed. The smell of burning oil mixed with the acrid stench of gunpowder and fear. Through the fuselage window, he could see the engine on fire, flames licking backwards across the wing like an orange tongue. The propeller had stopped. The cowling was torn open. And worse, far worse, the mounting bolts that held the entire engine to the wing were shearing off one by one. If that engine fell, it would take half the wing with it. The plane would spiral. 9 men would die. Frank reached into his tool bag and pulled out the only thing he had left. A roll of standard-issue military duct tape, olive drab, 2 inches wide, sticky on one side, laughed at by every mechanic in the 8th Air Force. His crewmates had mocked him for carrying it. "What are you going to do, Kowalski? Tape a bomber back together?" one had joked. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, strained, barely audible through the static. "We're losing No. 3. I can't hold altitude. We're going down." Frank didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He grabbed that roll of tape, wrapped it around his gloved hand, and climbed out onto the catwalk. What happened in the next 11 minutes would defy every engineering manual, every safety protocol, and every assumption about what was possible at 22,000 feet. They called his duct tape fix a joke, until his B-17 limped home with one engine missing. And the entire crew lived to tell the story. 4 days earlier, on March 13th, 1944, at the 381st Bomb Group airfield in Ridgewell, England, Frank Kowalski sat on an overturned fuel drum outside the maintenance hangar. The sky was grey, as it always was. Rain drizzled steadily, turning the airfield into a soup of mud and grease. Around him, mechanics worked in silence, their hands black with oil, their faces lined with exhaustion. The war had been grinding on for years. By early 1944, the Allied bombing campaign over Nazi Germany had reached a brutal crescendo. Every day, hundreds of American bombers took off from England, flying deep into enemy territory to strike factories, rail yards, oil refineries. And every day, some of them didn't come back. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the backbone of that campaign. A 4-engine heavy bomber, it was designed to carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and defend itself with 1350 caliber machine guns. It was tough, resilient, capable of absorbing incredible punishment. But it wasn't invincible. Frank knew that better than most. He had been a flight engineer with the 381st since October of 1943. He had watched planes come back with wings shredded, tails blown off, engines dead. He had seen crews bail out over the English Channel, watched parachutes drift down into the freezing water. And he had learned one hard truth. When something breaks at 20,000 feet, you don't call for help. You fix it yourself or you die. But there were rules, strict rules. During a pre-flight briefing that morning, the commanding officer, a square-jawed colonel from Ohio, had laid them out clearly. "No one," he said, pointing at a diagram of a B-17, "attempts emergency repairs in flight unless absolutely necessary. If you lose an engine, you feather it, you shut it down. You do not, under any circumstances, attempt to jury-rig a fix mid-mission. That's how you lose planes." The room was silent. Everyone nodded. Frank nodded too. But in the back of his mind, a question burned. What if shutting it down wasn't enough? What if the engine didn't just stop, but fell off? He raised his hand. "Sir, what if the mounting structure fails?" The colonel looked at him like he'd asked a stupid question. "Then you bail out, Sergeant. You don't play mechanic at altitude." Frank didn't argue, but he also didn't agree. That night, he went back to his bunk and opened his tool bag. Inside was the usual assortment: wrenches, screwdrivers, safety wire, a small hammer. And tucked in the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a roll of duct tape. It had been issued to him months ago as part of a field repair kit. Most mechanics threw it away. It was cheap, unreliable, prone to freezing in cold temperatures. But Frank kept it, not because he thought it was magic, but because it was better than nothing. Frank Emil Kowalski was born in 1921 in the steel town of Gary, Indiana, where the air smelled like iron and the sky glowed orange at night from the blast furnaces. His father, Joseph, worked at US Steel for 32 years. His mother, Anna, took in laundry to make ends meet. Frank grew up in a world of machines, noise, and hard work. By the time he was 12, he could disassemble a car engine and put it back together without instructions. He wasn't a genius, he was just patient, methodical, and stubborn as hell. When the war started, Frank was 19 and working at a Ford assembly plant in Detroit. He didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in December of 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. He wanted to be a pilot, but his eyesight wasn't good enough, so they made him a mechanic. At first, he was disappointed. He wanted to fly, to fight. Instead, he was stuck on the ground, covered in grease, fixing other people's planes. But over time, he realized something. Pilots got the glory, but mechanics kept them alive. By the time Frank arrived in England in the fall of 1943, he had been trained on every system of the B-17 flying fortress. He knew the electrical systems, the hydraulics, the fuel lines, the turbo superchargers. He could diagnose a problem by sound alone. A high-pitched whine meant a bearing was failing. A rhythmic clunk meant a propeller was out of balance. A hiss meant a hydraulic line was leaking. And when he was assigned to the crew of Lucky Strike, a B-17G, piloted by Lieutenant James Jimmy Dalton, a 23-year-old farm kid from Iowa, Frank became more than just a mechanic. He became the crew's insurance policy. If something broke, Frank fixed it. On the ground, in the air, it didn't matter. He didn't care about regulations. He cared about getting his crew home. But Frank had a problem. He believed in improvisation, and the Army Air Forces did not. The military ran on manuals, procedures, protocols. There was a right way to fix a plane and a wrong way. And anything that wasn't in the manual was, by definition, wrong. Frank didn't see it that way. He saw rules as guidelines, not laws. And when those guidelines failed, he made up his own. That's why he carried the duct tape. That's why, on March 17, 1944, when the No. 3 engine started to tear itself apart over the Ruhr Valley, Frank didn't hesitate. He grabbed the tape and went to work. Because sometimes the only thing standing between life and death is a 2-inch roll of sticky fabric and the willingness to use it. March 17, 1944, St. Patrick's Day. The weather was miserable as usual. Low clouds, freezing rain, visibility near zero. But the mission was on. The target was a synthetic oil refinery in Gelsenkirchen, deep in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. The plan was simple. 200 B-17s would take off from bases across England, form up into massive formations, and fly east into Germany. Fighter escorts would protect them as far as they could. Then the bombers would be on their own. The flak would be heavy. The fighters would be waiting. But the mission was critical. Without oil, the German war machine would grind to a halt. And so, at 0630 hours, the engines of Lucky Strike roared to life. Frank Kowalski stood in the waist of the plane, checking equipment, tightening straps, running through his mental checklist. Everything looked good. The engines sounded strong. The hydraulics were solid. The oxygen system was working. They were ready. At 0700, they lifted off. The climb to altitude was smooth. The formation tightened. By 0900, they were over the English Channel, heading east. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, casting long shadows across the water. It was almost beautiful. Almost. Then they crossed into German airspace. And everything changed. The flak started at 10:15 hours. Black puffs of smoke exploding all around them, each one a proximity-fused shell designed to shred aluminum and flesh. The plane bucked and shuddered. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. Frank braced himself against the bulkhead, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. This was the part he hated. The waiting. The helplessness. On the ground, he could fix things. Up here, all he could do was hope. At 10:42 hours, the intercom crackled. "Fighters at 2 o'clock high!" German Fokker-Wulf 190s, diving out of the sun. The 50 caliber machine guns opened up, filling the plane with the deafening roar of automatic fire. Spent shell casings rained down like brass hail. The smell of cordite was overwhelming. Frank moved to the window and looked out. He could see the fighters, black shapes against the grey sky, rolling and diving, guns flashing. One of them came straight at them. The top turret gunner fired. Tracer rounds arced through the air. The fighter banked away, trailing smoke. But not before it got a burst off. The number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing, erupted in flames. The explosion was instantaneous. A bright orange fireball, followed by a plume of black smoke. The propeller stopped spinning. The engine cowling tore away, flapping in the wind like a broken bird. And then Frank saw it. The engine mounting bolts. They were shearing off, one by one. He could see them snapping, the metal twisting, the engine shifting forward, pulling away from the wing. If it fell, it would take the fuel lines with it. The wing would catch fire. The plane would explode. He grabbed the intercom. "Pilot, this is Kowalski. Number 3 is coming apart. If we don't stabilize it, we're going down." Lieutenant Dalton's voice came back, tight with stress. "Can you feather it?" "It's already feathered, but the mounting bolts are failing. The engine's going to tear off." There was a pause. Then, "What do you need?" Frank looked at his tool bag, then at the roll of duct tape. "Permission to go out on the catwalk." Another pause. Longer this time. "Kowalski, you can't fix an engine mount in flight." "I know, sir, but I can hold it together long enough to get us home." Silence. Then, "Do it." Frank Kowalski had never been afraid of heights. But standing on the narrow catwalk that ran along the inside of the B-17's fuselage, staring at the hole in the side of the plane where the waist gunner's window used to be, he felt something close to fear. Not panic, just a cold, clear understanding of how easy it would be to die. The wind outside was a howling monster. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The plane was still under attack. Flak bursts shook the airframe like a dog shaking a rat. But Frank didn't think about any of that. He thought about the problem. The number 3 engine was held to the wing by 4 large mounting bolts. 2 of them had already sheared off. A third was cracked. The 4th was holding, but barely. The engine, weighing over 1,000 pounds, was suspended by essentially nothing. It swung back and forth in the slipstream, pulling on the wing structure, bending the aluminum, tearing the metal. If it fell, it would rip a hole in the wing. Fuel would pour out. Fire would follow. End of story. Frank's plan was absurd. He was going to wrap duct tape around the engine mount and the wing spar, not to replace the bolts. That was impossible, but to create enough tension, enough friction to hold the engine in place long enough to get home. It was insane. Duct tape wasn't designed for this. It wasn't rated for high altitude, sub-zero temperatures, or the stress of a vibrating engine. It would probably fail in minutes. But minutes were all he needed. He opened the hatch, clipped his safety line to a bracket, and crawled out onto the catwalk. The wind hit him like a fist. His goggles fogged instantly. Ice formed on his gloves. He couldn't hear anything but the roar of the engines and the scream of the wind. He reached the damaged section and looked down. The engine hung at an angle, flames still licking from the cowling, smoke pouring into the slipstream. He could see the wing spar, a thick beam of aluminum that ran the length of the wing. and he could see the broken mounting bracket, twisted and bent. He pulled out the roll of duct tape. What followed was less like engineering and more like faith. Frank wrapped the tape around the engine mount, looping it over and over, pulling it tight, pressing it down with numb fingers. The tape stuck, barely. The cold made it stiff, brittle. But it held. He wrapped more, layer after layer, circling the mount, the spar, the broken bracket, creating a web of reinforcement. It looked ridiculous. Like something a child would do with a broken toy. But it worked. The engine stopped swinging. The vibration decreased. The wing stopped flexing. Frank wrapped the entire roll, 40 yards of tape, around the structure. When he was done, he crawled back inside, his hands frozen, his face numb, his lungs burning. He collapsed on the floor of the fuselage, gasping. The intercom crackled. "Kowalski, what's your status?" Frank coughed. "It's holding, sir. For now." The flight back to England was 2 hours of pure agony. Every minute, Frank expected to hear the sound of tearing metal, to feel the plane lurch as the engine finally broke free. But it didn't. The duct tape held. The engine, dead and useless, stayed attached to the wing. The flames died out. The smoke faded. And slowly, impossibly, Lucky Strike limped west. They couldn't keep up with the formation. Lieutenant Dalton throttled back the remaining 3 engines to reduce strain on the damaged wing. They dropped altitude, falling behind the main bomber stream. That made them vulnerable. Stragglers were easy targets. German fighters loved stragglers. But luck, or maybe something more, stayed with them. They saw fighters in the distance, but none attacked. The flak thinned out as they crossed back into Allied territory, and by 14:30 hours, they could see the coast of England. The landing was the hardest part. With one engine out and another barely holding on, Dalton had to come in fast, steeper than normal. The runway at Ridgewell rushed up at them. The wheels hit hard. The plane bounced once, twice, then settled. The brakes screamed, metal groaned. And then, finally, they stopped. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the crew started cheering, shouting, laughing. Frank just sat there, staring at his hands. They were still shaking. When the ground crew saw the plane, they couldn't believe it. The number 3 engine was barely attached, held in place by what looked like a cocoon of olive drab tape. One mechanic walked up to Frank and said, "You're out of your goddamn mind." Frank shrugged. "Maybe, but I'm alive." The story spread through the 381st Bomb Group like wildfire. By that evening, everyone knew about the mechanic who taped an engine to a B-17. Some laughed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some called it luck. But the crew of Lucky Strike didn't laugh. They knew what Frank had done. He had saved their lives. The commanding officer called Frank into his office the next morning. Frank expected a reprimand. Maybe even a court-martial. Unauthorized modifications to aircraft were a serious offence, but the colonel just looked at him for a long time, then said, "Did you really use duct tape?" "Yes, sir." "And it worked?" "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "Well, I'll be damned." Over the next few days, something strange happened. Other crews started asking Frank for advice. Mechanics started carrying duct tape in their tool bags. And quietly, without any official acknowledgement, the Army Air Forces began experimenting with adhesive reinforcement techniques for emergency repairs. Frank's fix was never formally adopted. It couldn't be. It was too unconventional, too unreliable, too dependent on individual judgment. But it proved something important. That sometimes, survival doesn't come from following the manual. It comes from knowing when to throw the manual away. Frank flew 17 more missions before the war ended. He never had to use duct tape again. But he always carried a roll, just in case. And when other crews saw it, they didn't laugh. They nodded, because they understood. In war, the difference between life and death is often measured not in firepower or armour, but in the willingness of one person to try something impossible. And sometimes, just sometimes, impossible works. Frank Kowalski returned to Gary, Indiana in October of 1945. He went back to work at the Ford plant, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 kids. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say, "I fix planes, that's all." But the story of the duct tape fix lived on. It became legend in the maintenance crews of the Air Force, passed down from one generation of mechanics to the next. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, a flight engineer on a damaged C-130 cargo plane used a similar technique, wrapping cargo straps and adhesive tape around a cracked wing spar. The plane made it home. The engineer said he got the idea from an old story he'd heard in training. In the 1990s, a researcher at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, found a faded after-action report from the 381st Bomb Group. It described an emergency repair using non-standard adhesive material on a B-17 during a mission over Germany in March 1944. The pilot's name was listed, Lieutenant James Dalton. The mechanic's name was redacted, but in the margins, someone had written in pencil Kowalski's tape job. Frank died in 1998 at the age of 77. His funeral was small, attended mostly by family and a few old friends. But among the mourners was a man in an Air Force uniform. He was young, maybe 30, with the insignia of a maintenance officer. After the service, he approached Frank's son and handed him something, a roll of olive drab duct tape. "Your father saved my grandfather's life," the officer said. "Lieutenant Dalton was my grandfather. I'm named after him." He paused. "I wanted you to have this. It's from the same batch they used in World War II. I carry one in my tool bag, just like your father did." Frank's son looked at the tape, then at the officer. "Why?" The officer smiled. "Because it reminds me that the best tool you can have isn't always the one they issue you. Sometimes it's the one you believe in." Frank Kowalski never set out to be a hero. He never wanted recognition, never sought fame. He was just a mechanic from Indiana who refused to accept the word impossible. But his story, the story of a man who wrapped an airplane engine in duct tape at 22,000 feet and somehow made it work, carries a lesson that transcends war, transcends time. It's a lesson about resourcefulness, about refusing to give up when the odds are impossible, about trusting your instincts when everyone else says you're wrong. In a world that worships technology, that demands perfection, that insists on following every rule, Frank's story is a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the simplest, that sometimes you don't need a better tool. You just need the courage to use the one you have. The military learned from Frank's improvisation. Modern aircraft now carry emergency repair kits that include high-strength adhesive tape, designed for exactly the kind of situation Frank faced. It's not called duct tape, it's called speed tape or aircraft tape. But the principle is the same. Hold it together, get it home, fix it right later. But here's the real question. How many times in your own life have you faced a problem that seemed impossible? How many times have you been told, "That won't work, you can't do that, there's no solution"? And how many times did you walk away because you believed them? Frank Kowalski didn't walk away. He grabbed a roll of tape and climbed out onto the wing. Because he understood something that most people never learn. The only difference between impossible and possible is the willingness to try. So what about you? What's your roll of duct tape? What problem are you facing right now that everyone says can't be solved? What fix are people calling a joke that might just save everything? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you think differently about what's possible, share it. Pass it on. Because somewhere, someone is standing at the edge of their own catwalk, staring at their own impossible problem. And maybe, just maybe, they need to hear about a stubborn mechanic from Indiana who proved that sometimes the most powerful tool in the world is the refusal to quit. Thank you for watching.